So hello all and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for the special Earth Day by the Book conversation about Barbara King's new book, Animals' Best Friends, Putting Compassion to Work for Animals in Captivity and in the Wild. If you've not seen it yet, here it is. If you could please remain muted throughout the event, that would be much appreciated. Your questions are of course very welcome. Just add them to the chat where I posted or very soon will post a link to the book at our partnering bookstore, the Seminary Co-op here in Chicago. And we'll return to the questions during the Q&A at the end of the hour. Some quick introductions. After 28 years of teaching anthropology at the College of William and Mary, Barbara King retired early to become a science writer and public speaker. Most recently, she is the author of Personalities on the Plate and How Animals Grieve, both published by Chicago. King's work has been featured at Scientific American, Aeon, Undark, Sapiens, NPR, the BBC, Times Literary Supplement, and Washington Post, among others. You may also have seen Barbara's 2019 TED Talk on animal love and grief. We are very fortunate to have Brandon Keim joining Barbara in conversation. Brandon is a freelance journalist specializing in nature, animals, and science. He tells stories of non-human minds and natural wonders and explores what it means to be human in a more than human world. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Wired, National Geographic, Nautilus, The Guardian, and The New York Times, among others. He is the author of The Eye of the Sandpiper and a forthcoming book on animal personhood, Meet the Neighbors. So without further ado, Brandon and Barbara, over to you, and I will continue admitting people.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate this. And a very big shout out of gratitude to you, Brandon. Hello in Maine. It's wonderful to be here with you. And thank you also to the Seminary Co-op. So I appreciate everyone's working together today to make this event possible. And hi to everybody who has joined us and is in the process of joining us. I'm here in Southeastern Virginia, getting ready to enjoy some outdoor chilly time on Earth Day.
Hey, Barbara, thanks so much for having me as your partner today.
Yeah.
And hello from, Maine, that until a couple days ago was warm and green and early spring, and now it's cold and gray. And, I gotta say, it's a little odd having these conversations where, I love watching them on Zoom, and I've done a number of events like this in front of crowds in person, and somehow I thought it would actually be easier to do it on Zoom because you're not in a crowd of people, and actually like having this virtual audience out there is somehow like a little more nerve-wracking, I've got to say.
Well, I think we're probably both very used to feeding off what we see, the energy in the room, but also because we're observers of animals, we look for primate gestures and primate facial expressions and primate postures of engagement, and we can't do that today.
I think that's exactly it, actually. I think there is something about like that feedback that you get from being around people, where now that it's just like me and my webcam, I'm like, do I look normal? Am I like, because that feedback loop is
I can assure you that you look entirely normal. So.
But actually that does make a good segue to the question that I wanted to start things off with, which is just how you went from somebody who is studying and observing animals, to somebody who's advocating for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I started out, interestingly, I was all about primates, non-human primates, and only non-human primates. So I kind of bought into the rap in graduate school that the animals closest to us, evolutionarily speaking, are the best and the brightest, the smartest, the most capable of emotional expression. And I went with that for a lot of years and did scholarly work, statistical work on baboons in Africa, studying great apes in captivity. And so there was a kind of intermediate step between being an anthropologist, focusing on other than human primates, and eventually becoming an activist. And that intermediate step was realizing that all of that primate centrism was not right, not correct, that there's a great deal of intelligence in the natural world and a great deal of emotional expression. And I think back to, you may know Ben Beck. He was a very important biologist at the Smithsonian and wrote a bunch of really good ethology articles. And he wrote this article in 1982 called Chimpocentrism that focused on the incredible learning and flexibility of herring gulls and how smart they are in what they do in terms of dropping shells in very smart ways on different substances and substrates. And very slowly I got to thinking that I needed to pay attention to the rest of the world. And when I started looking at other mammals and birds, reptiles, and eventually invertebrates, I started wanting to become a voice for them, as well as writing about them, because I began to appreciate that there's so many different ways to be intelligent, so many different ways to participate and contribute to this world that don't necessarily line up with the human standard. And that's kind of what fired me up.
Totally. Yeah, I think something I've become more cognizant of over the last couple of years is the critique that has really come out, or come out partially from the disability community, kind of saying, hey, wait a second, let's stop valorizing, particular forms of cognition when we look at animals and when we, sort of create our hierarchy of those animals who matter to us. Because if it's just, the most quote unquote intelligent species and the ones who are capable of behaving in the ways that we've decided are meaningful, then we keep that habit when it comes to our relations with other human beings. And kind of have those hierarchies as well. But that being said, at the risk of re-inscribing those hierarchies, so spiders are amazing, right? Like, and if you spend any time with the literature on spider cognition, like, you'll just constantly be blown away, like, not just by the cognitive stuff, but by the parental care, the analogs of emotion, the mental time travel, all these things. And I enjoy in your book how jumping spiders figure prominently in the spiders in your home. And like, yeah, I know following you on Twitter during the pandemic, there's been, it's been such a joy to follow along with you as you discover the world of birds outside the window. But it's the observations of spiders that I'm especially curious about. And also whether, I think you mentioned that you spent, several weeks kind of watching them with some rigor in your backyard. And yeah, talk to me about your spider experiences, and also whether, there are tips and tricks that you learned in rigorously observing primates that, all of us can apply to the spiders on the lawn.
Okay, Brandon, I have so much to say, and I'm going to start with referring back to your work, because I used to think of animal observation as, okay, I'm in Kenya, I'm at Amboseli National Park. This is a fantastic place to see baboons and elephants and any number of animals. Or I go to Yellowstone and I watch the bison. And, reading you as well as others, but you in particular, helped me realize that my backyard is wild, my backyard is nature, my backyard is wilderness. And your essay about vacant lots, for example, that I mentioned in my book, was just very, very eye-opening to me, that there's life everywhere and there's wildness everywhere. And I have a passage in the book where I talk about something that happened maybe 10 years ago, where I walked into the bathroom and I saw two spiders. I'm pretty sure they were wolf spiders. They were doubled up side by side. They were looking at me. I was home alone in the house, and I took a shoe and I killed them. And I have for 10 years regretted and felt shame and sadness about that. And in some ways, I did that with fear, reactivity, emotion, and they were dead. But that was a turning point for me, because I was starting to open up in the ways that I've mentioned to the various intelligences in the world. And I realized, what am I doing? I was raised to think of spiders as dirty and useless, squash them with a tissue. That's the best thing to do, the right thing to do. But I began to finally really interrogate that and start to read One of your tweets from a couple of years ago actually said, here's an abstract of a cool article that talks about extended cognition in spiders. And you said, let's boil it down. Spiders think with their webs. Do you remember that?
Totally.
Okay. So the idea of extended cognition is part of what really drew me in, that when spiders, the orb weavers, not all spiders, when spiders are building webs, they're thinking as they do this in the way that we think externally with the tools in our world, or we build an environment around us. And then I started reading more and more. There's some experiments that I talk about in the book where spiders are put on virtual reality treadmills. And I think we could raise questions about ethics perhaps. But when you do that, you get to learn a little bit about how they think and what they think and how they transfer perception from one real world environment to another virtual reality environment where you can see them thinking. So I joined a jumping spider group on Facebook, and I started to meet everybody's jumping spiders, people who knew spiders in their yards or had spiders in their homes. I read a book published by Chicago saying that when you rescue spiders and you do the thing that you think is wonderful, you take a little glass, you put a top on the glass, you get the spider out of the house, you may not be doing the spider that much good because they may want to live in your house. That may be the best ambient environment for them. And all these things were kind of exploding in my head. And then in August and September, where I live in southeastern Virginia, there are garden spiders, writing spiders, the genus Argiope. And I started realizing that they were setting up their webs right outside my study window, outside, all parts of our house. And then I had this little natural laboratory to go and watch, building their webs, catching prey, how the female would act versus the much smaller male. And I named a spider. I have to admit, I finally got to the point where I was so fond of one spider that I named her Portia after Adrian Tchaikovsky's wonderful science fiction books that have sentient spiders in them.
That's where that comes from.
Yeah, it was just, so, in terms of tips, I think what I would say to anyone watching animals is what you do is you still yourself and you watch them in their world, whether you're watching bison in Yellowstone, baboons in Yellowstone National Park, or spiders in your backyard. And I don't think there's a trick to it as much as time, patience, overcoming assumptions if you have them. Not everyone did, but I did, about spiders, and then letting them show you who they are. And Brandon, you've written about emotion in honeybees. You've written about all kinds of things with insects. So you must watch insects and spiders as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I lack the patience of a great pathologist to have going still come easily to me. But I manage it sometimes, and with jumping spiders in particular, what I think is so fascinating is, so sometimes I'll be outside working and I'll see a jumping spider and get my camera and my macro attachment and get down there in the grass and get some photographs, and it always blows my mind that like that spider is clearly watching me, right? Like I'll be down on my stomach and camera up to my eye, and I can see the spider magnified in the viewfinder, and maybe I'll move to the side. And that spider is tracking me the whole time. And, I don't know. I don't know what kind of the behavioral repertoire of spiders is when it comes to feeling fear or having fear transmuted into something more than that. So I don't know if I can, I don't even know if saying that, that spider is not afraid of me or that spider is being brave. I don't know if that applies, but clearly that spider is someone there looking back at me. And I try to put myself in that spider's feet and be like, if there was some creature like the size of a skyscraper, right, who was clearly focused in on me, how would I react? And I mean, I think I would be horrified or petrified or something. But I always feel like the spider is kind of engaging as an equal, and that's such a neat.
Well, yeah, engagement I think is a very good word, because I too try to avoid trying to project what the spider might be thinking or feeling. But there's a sense of engagement, and a sense of attunement is another word that I use. And I feel this with bees in the yard, with sometimes a dragonfly, with a number of other animals. And, I was excited and really shocked when I learned that scientists together, astrophysicists and arachnologists, concluded that many spiders can see the moon, that they have these telescopic like eyes. And they did all kinds of calculations that I could not possibly replicate to suggest that there's an awareness, if they're going about their day or their night, I guess more appropriately, and they're looking at the sky, they have the ability to apprehend. And so, we're in the same world. We don't have the same sensory systems, but they overlap to some degree. They overlap. I think that's so cool.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I love the idea of spiders looking up and seeing the moon like
Yeah.
And I should say also that, when I say that I don't know if spiders are capable of fear or not and what have you, it's, that's not like sort of invoking some rule that we can never really know what spiders think, or, how could such tiny creatures have sophisticated emotional repertoires? Like, it is absolutely possible. I don't know what the literature says.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But maybe this is a bit of overlap with this question, but there was a passage from the book where you write, kind of about this experience of observation. In the best moments, something magical happens, akin to turning a kaleidoscope and seeing the world's design in a fresh way. I feel with, rather than only look at, the landscape of animals. What can you tell me more? Sort of what does that mean, and how does that shift in perception kind of change your relations to the wild world, to what we call nature?
Feeling with. Yes, I think that's a great topic for today, because feeling with is a feeling of joy. And I really want Earth Day to be, among other things too, a day of joy where we talk about how wonderful it is to have all these fellow travelers on our Earth. And, Earth Day too has to be about difficult topics and has to be about fighting extinction. But I want there to be that sort of explosion of joy as we talk about it. And that's what I feel when I feel with an animal. And, you mentioned birds, and I have just become so smitten with watching the birds in my backyard. And what's so interesting to me is I spend my day with cats indoors, rescued cats, and we have not just attunement, but mutuality and reciprocity and all kinds of shared communication systems as mammals. And I know, to varying degrees perhaps, but I know these companions care about me. And yet I'm sitting, in my sunroom or outside on the stairs, and I'm training my eyes and my camera on these birds, and I know they don't care about me at all. And so my question becomes then, how can I feel with them if they sort of marvelously don't care about what I'm doing in the day? And yet I do because I see them as beings who, again, are sharing my world with a whole different way of being in the world, but yet a commonality as well. And that is, I think, what brings me joy. And of course, I can't help but relate that to my work on grief and love. I've been so steeped in this work for the last 10 years, and that learning just how many other animals, I believe, can be quite scientifically and rigorously described as loving and grieving when a loved one dies. That gives me a fellow feeling with so many animals. And yet, I think what you said about how we don't want to set up this hierarchy. For example, if spiders, do they love or do they grieve? And does it matter? I still feel with them. So there's all these different ways and different entry points with different animals, where one doesn't necessarily have to be better than another, but just knowing, I believe, that whatever animal we're talking about, almost exclusively, there's going to be some shared way of being.
Totally. I think also, this is a subject that's certainly open for debate, but I think there have been so many types of behavior, grief certainly among them, where, let's say in the last 20 or 30 years, kind of the conventional scientific thinking has gone from thinking about them as being incredibly sophisticated, only possessed by us, to, still really sophisticated, but, possessed by a few other creatures as well. And then thinking about them as, existing on a spectrum of behavioral possibilities, of which our kind and the kind shared by other primates and whales and what have you is, represents one set of what's possible, but there's still a whole spectrum out there in which a great many species partake. And I think, this doesn't just apply to grief now. Like, I think of self-awareness is another great capacity where there's, we've kind of gone from thinking that self-awareness is like, okay, it's only humans and a few species who can pass, the mirror self-recognition test. But then there's something that philosophers call pre-reflective or non-reflective self-awareness. And, and the idea there is that, no, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about yourself and picturing yourself in your mind's eye, but you still know that you are you, and that, you still have that sense of self. And that, I think, is really like, it's everywhere out there. It's every vertebrate and quite a few invertebrates. And when it comes to care and emotions, I think that might, or is probably the case as well. And I mean, here, like, I'm not a scientist. I'm somebody who talks to a lot of scientists and then tries to figure out what I think about what they're telling me. But, like, when I watch sometimes in the garden, I'll disturb a spider who's carrying an egg sac. And I remember this one time I kind of knocked the egg sac away from the spider, and watching like how frantic that spider will get. And then, like, if you manage to find the egg sac and reunite them, then like, I think there's clearly an expression of relief. That spider is much happier having her egg sac than not having it. And when they're separated, she is distressed by that. And, like, that's care. I think
Yes.
care is everywhere out there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was very enamored for years of the mirror self-recognition test, and now, not so much, because I think it's a gatekeeping
Yeah.
thing. It started out as a measure of human exceptionalism, and then, as you say, we let in a few to the club, but I don't think that's the way to go anymore. And I also think, in hearing what you're talking about, that there's something to be said here still about hierarchies, because one thing I've been saying when I talk about domestic animals is that we like our orcas, elephants, chimpanzees to be smart, but we're not so happy when domestic animals like chickens, pigs, cows are smart. And I see a parallel argument there to the kind of thing that you're talking about, that there's a gatekeeping there of a different type because our food for some is threatened. Or, for example, just the way that we set up how we entertain ourselves, or how we think about science as animal models essential to science. All of these things are very hierarchical. And the more that we can focus on a simple fact that animals want to live, they just do, whether they're spiders and they're caring for their young, or they're pigs who are not wanting to be in a slaughterhouse, or there's a monkey who doesn't want to be in a biomedical laboratory. And this expresses itself again in so many different ways, but that fundamental force is again part of my feeling of being with, that acknowledgement.
Yeah. And that, I think this is actually a really good transition to something else that I very much wanted to talk to you about. So of course, every animal wants to live. That's a baseline. But that being said, every animal is eventually going to die. And whether or not an animal is killed is not necessarily the end all and be all of our moral judgments. And I think this is something that comes through in the chapter that you have on hunting. And you differentiate between people who are hunting recreationally or trophy hunting, and then those people who are hunting ethically or subsistence. And not that ethical or subsistence hunting can't also be problematic. But you're able to say, okay, you know what, I'm not necessarily in the absolute moral right here. These people are also coming from a place of care and compassion, and there's some real common ground to be found. And and I think that now more than ever, that is a wonderful message. And it's something I struggle with as a journalist sometimes, where it's really my duty to engage with a full range of perspectives. Even if I don't necessarily agree with them, I need to suspend that. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of how you have those conversations. What is the best way to to find common ground with people who you might disagree with in some ways?
It's hard. It's a struggle. And I know people would say that right back to me, because if we disagree, I'm sure they're feeling that I'm as much of a struggle as anyone else. The hunting part of that chapter was really hard for me. I struggle a lot with the notion of hunting. I have not done it. I could not do it. But I also felt, because I have colleagues and friends who hunt, what I needed to do was at the very least listen to where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, we still, I think, disagree. And what I want to do is to be able to say that it is possible in certain cases, and they may be very limited cases, to really have that mutual respect. I mean, it's so much in this world exists on a continuum, and I wouldn't want to conflate trophy hunters, for whom I have no respect or quarter or wish to discuss anything with, really, to people who spend their lives devoted to natural history and care for animals, and who say, I am not going to eat factory farm animals. I am going to shoot a wild pig in an overpopulated area, and that wild pig is going to sustain me for months. That is not my approach. And what I would like to do are two things. I would like to hear that. And at the same time, I would like to say, here's my perspective, which is that the world is not a binary. The binary isn't, I either eat factory farm animals or I eat animals that I've shot. I'd like to open up that discussion and talk about plant-based eating. And so when I interviewed people for my book, I tried to do both. I tried to listen, and to be quite fundamentally honest, I tried also to just a little bit push and say, if I'm here to be an advocate for animals, perhaps it's okay if I just say back something that I think maybe the other person could think of as I'm thinking about their perspective. Yeah. And I wondered if we could talk about plant-based eating a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I don't want to ask a completely banal question like, what do you think of it? But but what do you think are the possibilities of it? Maybe actually to push back a little bit and maybe ask something a little uncomfortable and see what comes out of it. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of plant-based meats in general. By all means, let's get them into the world at scale. But there's always those nagging critiques of, but do we necessarily know that this translates into reduced consumption of meat? Do we actually, is it going to be displacing meat eating necessarily? And I feel like the jury's still out. We're all very hopeful about it, but we don't yet know. So tell me why you're so hopeful about plant-based.
Well, I think this is the time when the notion of humility re-enters the conversation, simply because I feel comfortable with your saying that we have a lot of open-ended questions. But I've really been taught so much by really deeply compassionate vegans who were, of course, decades, way ahead of anything I've ever written in talking about these issues. And I think that what I've taken from so many of the vegans that I've read, Carol Adams, Tobias Leonard, I believe that Isa Leshko may be on this phone call, all these people who are compassionate for all of us make me realize, first of all, there's a difference between plant-based eating and being a vegan, because being a vegan is, a lifestyle of compassion in many, many contexts. But the idea is aspirational, that we know, I believe, that whatever and whoever we eat, we are doing some kind of harm. And I don't think that vegans are by any means unaware of this, because they're the ones who've sort of taught me this, that if you're eating a completely plant-based diet, there are going to be animals killed in that process. But what it is incumbent upon us to do, I think, is to try to aspire to do, the least harm that we can do. And the part of my anthropological training that, perhaps contributes in some way to the conversation is saying that my heart is with the idea of a plant-based world. But, I've lived in East Africa, I've lived in West Africa, and I know from people that I've met that the millions of people who depend on small farming of chickens, small farming of pigs, fishing, seafood, this is real. This is where people are. And I think that to a certain extent, if we're really going to talk about justice in a cross-cultural way of food justice and justice for the world, we have to realize that simply saying, we're all going to go plant-based at this moment just doesn't link up all the parts of the conversation. So we are not all in the same place. We don't all have the same resources. So I am very struck by the idea of reducitarian eating, to the extent that each individual, each family, each population can, where they are, excuse me, consume less meat, less dairy, less seafood. That's very, very important as a global type of conversation and contribution.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think the reducitarian is a great one. And something I guess I find myself wondering, maybe this is just sort of philosophical and abstract, but it's been on my mind, is that, so if I say, well, it's the way that pigs are treated on industrial farms in North America is just really awful. And I just don't want to participate in that at all. I don't want to eat any industrial bacon. And the reducitarian approach says, well, hey, we all need to eat less. This is something we should avoid. So try to eat half as much. But if it's just wrong, is half as wrong all that much better? And I feel like it is. But it's hard for me to make a case for it, to passionately argue for being bad. And how do you think about that?
Oh, I think about this daily. I mean, I eat no pigs and no chickens and no octopus and on and on. At the same time, I am better described as at an extreme end of being reducitarian, because I'm not 100% vegan. I'm not quite there. And so that gives me a sense of guilt at times and a sense of humility at others. I mean, there are very many different ways to be a reducitarian. And I will just say bluntly that, if you're back at sort of meatless Monday, I'm just going to eat one less meatless meal a week. That's not what I think the heart of reducitarian activism is. I think that it's much more serious to really push ourselves to recognize. I mean, we know the numbers, right? It's Earth Day. So I feel sort of obligated to trot out a number and say 86% of the world's, the world's farmland is taken up with meat production. And 56% of the measured greenhouse gases are tied back in some ways to industrial agriculture. So we know that kindness to animals here is kindness to the planet, is kindness to us. And this is a place where compassion just reverberates. And it's not going to get us to perfection, but it gets us to a place that I think is progress, is better, to really think about the fact that when we don't eat animals, we're preventing just so much suffering in so many ways, at the same time that we have to scale up resources to make it available for farmers who don't want to be connected to industrial ag anymore, who can do this. Mercy for Killing is an organization that I admire, and they have a project called Transformation for farmers who really want to sort of make that switch. The question is, again, how much is enough? But we have to just keep trying. And I think I'm extremely moved by all the people sort of all around the planet who are doing all kinds of things to make this happen. And on Earth Day, I just want to recognize that. I could name all kinds of people. I'm just going to name one for the moment. Joanne MacArthur, who's an investigative photojournalist, has not only gone all around the world to investigate animals in slaughterhouses, animals in labs, animals in zoos, but has made this amazing free archive, free if you're going to credit We Animals, the organization, free if you're writing or speaking about these issues, to make people available. And the upshot of her generosity and We Animals' generosity in doing this is for us to see that there's a whole bunch of people working on these issues, and this includes who we eat and who we don't eat, and that we're just moving the needle. We're moving, the arc of justice all together. So half of doing something halfway better it's just part of the contribution. I mean, how do you think of it? I'd like to know how you think.
So a little while ago, I was talking to an ecologist named Francisco Santiago Avila.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so I asked him, because a lot of the ideas that that sort of provide the philosophical underpinnings of the book that I'm working on now, come from people who are thinking about animals sort of from that, who are vegans or who are, thinking about animals in really sympathetic ways. And, and of course, 95% of people out there are not vegan. And I don't want people to look at the book and be like, well, this is just veganism for nature, and it's not something, how am I going to relate to that? And I don't mean any of this judgmentally, right? Because we're all on a spectrum. Nobody's hands are clean. So we all have a footprint. There isn't some line of people who are good on one side and bad on the other. And but anyways, I just said to him, like, what do I say to somebody who just sort of rejects all this as veganism for nature? And his response was that for him, veganism isn't about whether you consume animal products or don't, but whether you are engaged in a continual process of reflection, just trying to do better, and you're humble and aware that you're not perfect, and you can keep doing better, and you're not judging other people, according to some black and white standard. And yeah, that works for me.
I do struggle. I had a couple of incidents recently where, a good friend came to me and was talking about, excitement over having lamb for Easter. And I just shut down, because everything crashed together in my head. Okay, I value humility, I value conversation, I value dialogue, but at the end of the day, I value the lamb. And what do I say when I have spent years writing books and doing this public activism, and someone just comes to me and says, well, there you go, this is what I'm excited about. And so, I talk the talk, I try to walk the walk, but there are times when it's hard. And another person recently put up, this is on social media, so this wasn't directed at me, but it came across my eyesight. I'm at a barbecue restaurant, and not only is the food great, but the art is great. And there was a picture of a pig on a spit, and I'm just feeling like, sick. And in those moments, I feel very disconnected from other people. And I forget all of my ideals and all of the sort of loftiness. And so I just want to acknowledge that sometimes I really screw up, and I just say, or say something like, how can you? And then I realize, of course, that I could look back on my last month and say, here's what I've done that I don't think I was good, or I should do better. And so it's very difficult, I think. And it's a continual process of trying to be better at the conversations and be better, in my own life, but always also failing.
And, it's, I think that it's interesting to me that there's this stereotype of vegans as kind of, loud and judgmental and always nagging. And I have to say, like, it's probably over the last 6 or 7 years that, I've gone from really knowing very few vegans and people in animal advocacy circles to knowing a great many more. And my impression is that actually most, just about every vegan I know has those moments of disconnection like you, and, has that tremendous difficulty where they're kind of confronted with manifestations of suffering everywhere they turn. And, and for the most part, they keep it to themselves. They're not, they're not getting up in people's faces and saying how terrible everything is all the time. But there is a tremendous burden on their souls. And, sometimes this is called, compassion fatigue, which I think is kind of really doesn't do it justice. But, you know, but one of the things that I liked so much about your newest book here is that, it talks about that, but it provides a hopeful vision. In every single chapter, you're describing things that are within people's power to achieve. And I think that at least feeling some agency and feeling like you can do a little bit of good in the world is such an important antidote to, to constantly feeling crushed by the suffering that exists in the world. And that doesn't just apply to like animal issues, right? That applies to any, any social justice issue. And so I know we're getting close to the limit here, and maybe a good way to go out would just be, what are the core things that for you, are the low-hanging fruit, the things that are within people's power to make a difference in the world right now, that we can all just, go out there and feel like we've done our part to make the world a little better.
Well, I think first of all, starting with stilling ourselves, looking and listening is just so important, so that, as I get older, it seems more and more excited by the simplest things. Yesterday, I found a slug on our porch after rain, and, I was so excited, and I called my husband, who's so into animals, and we're just watching this slug. And then I went online and read about slugs. They're mollusks, they have these retractable sort of tentacles. I'm reading all this stuff, and I think there's just a joy, again, that can be found in that gives us a place of replenishment to go out and do this work. And there's a reason why I had chose one epigraph for my book. It's an epigraph from Jeff Vandermeer's novel, Dead Astronauts, and it's joy can only remind you why you fight. And when I feel that sense of joy, it makes me, want to fight. So I think, for me, the first, medium, and final line is eating, who we eat. I think that is a chance 3 times a day, every single day, to make a difference. Everyone, absolutely everyone can do that. I also think that being very aware of how we entertain ourselves is really important. I mean, we don't have time to get into a long thing about zoos, SeaWorld, theme parks, but we can certainly think about where we're putting our dollars and open our eyes to animal exploitation. And one thing I just want to slip in here, which is not low-hanging fruit, but the idea of animals held in laboratories has become so important to me and is a central fact of what I'm working on with groups of others as well. I think what we can all do about that is when we read headlines that come out of biomedical laboratories that are very excited about finding out this thing or that thing, we can read the fine print, we can read the methodology, and we can understand what animals had to go through to make that headline happen. Because a lot of times what gets deleted, what gets lost, what gets dropped is, we found out this cool thing, and yet mice, rats, dogs, cats, monkeys, whatever, had to go through something pretty awful. And it is incumbent upon us to know that and to support other ways of doing science that are better ways of doing science. In other words, educate ourselves about technologies like organs on a chip, or low toxicity, zero dosing for humans, or human tissue cell cultures that can, begin to show us that the animal models that are not working successfully for human science, there is hope, but we can only really make that hope come alive if we educate ourselves. And I'm in the process of doing that. It's very much a journey for me. And there's a lot about that in the book.
Right on. Well, is there time for a little bit more conversation, or do we go to the Q&A now?
We have a little bit of time left. We have one question in the chat. Everyone, if you want to ask Barbara and Brandon any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll relay them onto them in these last 15 minutes. We could start that now, unless you guys really want to continue your conversation.
I'll leave that to Brandon. What is your pleasure?
Oh, it's my responsibility. Well, just maybe a little bit more. I think because it's Earth Day, it's good to go out in an Earth-oriented way. And so one of the things that strikes me as kind of weird and unfortunate is that I feel like there's this gap between the world of animal advocates and people who are just really into caring about animals, and then the environment and conservation communities. And like these are two communities who are devoted to caring about the non-human, which is amazing and wonderful. And you would think they should all be under the same tent together, but in practice that's mostly not the case. And I'm curious what you sort of think of, where's like what is the commonality there? What are the things that, I have a feeling this is mostly an animal-oriented audience. What are the ways in which we can get out there and really show our care for the natural world, but with that compassion for animals driving? And maybe even this just in our neighborhoods and backyards, right? Like, is there anything that you're doing differently now that you're more aware of the birds in your world?
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm trying to do is read both about more traditional ecosystemic conservation and also care and concern for individual animals, because I don't think that they necessarily have to be at odds. I know that sounds a little bit simplistic, but the conversations that are going on around compassionate conservation, we've talked about this, you and I, a little bit, I think are very, very important. I think one of the things that has struck me most forcefully is moving away from thinking only about conservation on public lands. The notion of national parks and reserves and land that's held for animals, plants, and the environment is critically important. And it's something that, I love going to those places and I care deeply that they're preserved. But it's also important for all of us to take whatever we have, whether it be our yards, our apartment balconies, our public parks, even our corporate parks, our college campuses, anything at all, and realize that they're full of life. They're full of mammals and birds and plants, and that we can help those species, whether it's planting more native plants or, recognizing that we don't have to demonize, but can rather help feral cats, even while we're also attempting to reduce the feral cat population with compassion to help birds and wildlife. I've been working a lot with feral cat advocates, and I am one, and I am also a bird person. These are not, there are overlapping identities. And I think the more that we can take our patch of not only ground where we live, but in our town and locally, that's the way to go for the future.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned like corporate parks and those sorts of environments, because there's, I think, so if there's any property developers watching this or watching please invite me to your conferences. I want to talk with you. And even just in the past year, so there was a development that was proposed on the land beside me, and we kind of got in there with the planning board and pushed back a bit, and ultimately really came to a compromise that worked for the developers and also worked for us as kind of the advocates for the non-humans living in the area, and there were just like a world of possibilities for laying out what happens in case of animal conflicts, not using lethal methods as a first resort.
Yes.
Also like implementing ecological management of like good mowing regimes, not using pesticides, not using road salts, like all of these things that that can be done in our cities and neighborhoods, and really like they're not, like they are low-hanging fruit, and most of the time like these aren't big fights, they're just things that people haven't really thought of too much yet, and if you suggest it, you're like, oh yeah, that's actually a good idea, let's do that. And just lastly, since to circle around to the beginning when you mentioned vacant lots and the essay, part part of what I loved so much about vacant lots in the middle of New York City was that, you know, these were the really almost the only spaces where wildness still prevailed. And, you know, like in recent times, the concepts of wilderness and wildness have come under a lot of critique for, you know, being socially constructed, for creating this dichotomy between pristine nature and, you know, tainted nature. And, you know, that, you know, to some extent, we kind of need to shed ourselves of these outdated notions of wildness and wilderness that make it difficult to imagine the type of thriving that humans and nature can have in the same place. And I think that's like, that is a super important critique, and it's absolutely true. But at the same time, you know, wilderness and wildness are also really the only philosophical ideas we have, or the only values we have, where the autonomy and agency of just everybody else who's not human is respected.
Yes.
And I still think, you know, there's still something important about wilderness and wildness, even if we realize that, you know, it's not all, yeah, that it's, sorry, I'm trailing off into space a little bit.
No, I get what you're saying.
They're still really important, even
Yeah.
even if the way that we think about them has been problematic historically.
Yeah, to give up some of that human control, you know, to let go of the notion of the pristine lawn, even just starting there, you know, with the anti-yard, the anti-lawn.
Oh yes, let your lawn grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, do it. Actually, yeah. So anybody out there, you've got a lawn, like put it on a cycle where you're like 1/3 once a year, and you can actually have that habitat variability even within a small.
Exactly.
Space. Even those places where the lawn is just being mowed once a year, you can still accomplish so much more. So yeah, happy Earth Day.
This is actually a perfect segue. So we have a question here from Amanda Stronza. She says, Barbara and Brandon, you're two of my favorite writers. I wonder if you could expound on the idea of including non-human beings in our moral universe and what that implies on a day-to-day basis. So I think we talked about that a little bit just now with lawns, but how might it change how we live as a species on Earth?
Wow. First of all, Dr. Amanda Stronza, hello. We are fans, of course, of your work. I think it's imperative to fight in every way human exceptionalism. You know, the idea that not only we're unique, of course we're unique, every species is unique, but that we're somehow special, deserving of more, you know, care than other animals. And that is harder to do in some ways than it sounds, and easier in others. You know, just looking at the rights that other animals have to be on this earth, we have invaded their homes. I mean, we know with urban ecology, more and more we're pushing animals, you know, into urban areas, and then people shoot them. I mean, lethal management is like the first go-to solution, and it shouldn't be. I think we need to really stop and understand in a very deep and profound way that morally, you know, the earth is not here for us. Animals are not here for us. And once you make that shift, it's very hard to go back. And then you start from that flow all these things about not killing a spider, not going to a theme park to watch a dolphin jump through a hoop, and thinking about who we eat. Brandon, what would you say?
I think, so as I understand the sort of history of thinking about animals within our moral universe, or the recent history of it, the first big names I was exposed to were Peter Singer and Tom Regan, and these very rights-based approaches. And then, to oversimplify, along come the ecofeminists saying that, hey, wait a second, this isn't just talking about what's right and wrong and what rights animals should have, doesn't capture the entirety of the conversation. Like, it's still absolutely necessary. Like, this isn't an either or, but we also need to be thinking about what sort of relationships we have, and what reciprocity there is. And like, reciprocity is so hot these days, I know, but and so for me, in addition to thinking about just what our moral compass is, and what is right, and what is wrong. There's such a huge space for thinking about, okay, like what do we give in return? What are the fair terms of engagement? And something and I really enjoyed in your book, Barbara, is where you're talking about zoos, and you say, okay, there's some animals who just absolutely should not be in zoos. There's certain ways of treating animals that this is just never going to be morally okay. But there are cases in which captive animals who are on display, can live good lives, and good things can be done in the world. And you encourage people to, really engage with zoos and sort of be an army of people who are going there and asking questions. How are these animals being treated? What's happening to them when they're not on display? What are the ways in which we can make their lives better? And of course, there's lots of great people working at zoos, who really want to care for the animals as best as possible too. And
can I just jump in there for 1 second? I just want to clarify that you're right in your description, but it's more because I worry that captivity itself is a harm, that I want people to be, in so many overwhelming numbers of cases. I think, having rescued animals that can't live on their own, rehabilitated animals, but I don't want people to avoid zoos because of that, unless they're terribly exploitative roadside zoos, and then of course they should. But if there are zoos where we can get in there and be part of the solution to saying, just speaking up, and I give examples in my book about, there's too much noise, music, or there's too small habitats, or there's, just to really be an advocate. And excuse me for interrupting you, but I do worry about captivity in zoos greatly. And that's kind of the way that I want to give back by engagement rather than disengaging.
Yeah. And I think that, so that ultimately is what bringing animals into our moral universe means, like engaging with, those points at which they come into our lives and trying to figure out, how to do it better.
So we have one comment, and I think if we can do one more question, maybe quickly. So the comment is, thank you, Barbara, for pointing out the often overlooked common ground between feral cat advocates and the conservation community. Many of us committed to humanely managing feral cat populations do so, at least in part, to protect wildlife and the environment.
Yes.
So thank you, Peter Wolf.
Yes, thank you, Peter Wolf.
Victoria Marie Green wants to ask you guys about veganism. So thinking about the conversation of how we navigate a world of animal suffering and doing what we can with our diet and being intentional in how we relate to this world, I sometimes get worried that veganism becomes more of a focus on the purity of our bodies, being completely free from animal products, which might fuel a problematic idea that humans are separate from nature and animals. How can we check ourselves in recognizing if we are starting to think in this way with our diets and actions, or does it not even matter so long as it's something to do to reduce animal suffering? Sorry.
Could you repeat the part about to check ourselves about something in our bodies? And I missed a key word.
So this notion of separating ourselves from eating animal products as a purity issue. So
purity, okay, that's the word I didn't hear. Yeah.
So how do we check that sort of thinking, or does it matter?
Okay. Well, that's the kind of purity that I'm after. I'm joking, because of course I'm never going to reach purity, but I'm very happy not to have animal products in my body. It makes me feel closer to animals, not further apart. It doesn't make me feel as if there's a boundary or a binary. One of the things I acknowledge a lot in my anthropology talks is that, we evolved as omnivores. Certainly we didn't evolve as carnivores, but we didn't evolve as herbivores either. We got to where we are and have large brains in part because we were eating meat. So the large brains that we have now allow us to look differently with compassion at the world and see that there are so many ways of closing any perceived gap between us and animals that doesn't depend on eating. For me, it's not an issue, because saying that I'm not going to eat an animal is a way of honoring the animal. So it brings me closer.
I think that's all we have time for. I'm putting the book link back in the chat there at the Seminary Co-op. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Barbara and Brandon, and happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much to my publisher, to my conversational partner, and to the audience. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Well, everyone.